thank you everyone for attending this 2016 Project-Based Language Learning Online Symposium. We have about 1 more hour in this session today. And thanks for all your questions. Project-based language learning is a relatively new discipline, and you may find yourself wondering a lot of different things about it as you hear these presentations. Allow your understanding to develop gradually and let things come into sharper focus gradually. It's a very complex and difficult construct to grasp all at one time. So over the next few days during this symposium, we hope that your understanding of PBLL will become clearer and clearer. All right. Charisse, we're still not hearing any sound from you.
No.
Oh, now I can hear you. So
fantastic.
Really good. So Charisse, if you can do a little bit of self-introduction, little background, and let us know if there's anything we can do for you. You are the presenter.
Perfect.
Oh, for everyone else, before I turn off my mic, you may notice that your screen changes when a presenter comes around. If you want to get your chat window back so that you can type questions, simply use your mouse to pass over the green stripe that tells you that you're viewing Charisse Montgomery's desktop, and that green stripe will pull down and you will see some buttons that will have the small windows for chat and to display the participants and so forth. Unfortunately, those small windows might cover up the content that Charisse is showing you. You can simply close those small windows using the X, the closing box in those windows, and you can always get them back again by going up to that green stripe. All right, so Charisse, I'm handing off to you. Tell us about yourself first before you begin.
Perfect. So my primary background is as a high school Spanish teacher. I taught at an urban public high school for a long time. I've also done elementary homeschool immersion classes, middle school immersion camps. I have taught at the community college level, and I am currently supervising our world language teacher preparation program for Spanish here at Brigham Young University. So I supervise student teachers and coordinate that program. So my comments are contextualized in those settings, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Charisse, as you start, let me just mention that right now your slides are showing in presenter mode, so we're seeing that screen that you as a presenter see, which is not really a problem. We see some of your notes and the next slide, and we see the like the image and so forth. Yes, now we're getting a full screen. All right,
perfect.
Take it away.
So I really only have 2 major goals for this session. The first is that when you get done, or when we get done, that you have a little bit better understanding of what are some of the key components that make immersive experiences in general successful or powerful, and how we can employ scaffolding strategies extracted from those concepts to better support language learners as they engage in project-based language learning. So as we get started, I'd like for you to kind of think in the back of your mind, or you might even want to drop this in the chat, the titles of some movies that have influenced you the most as an individual. Movies that have been in some way transformative or powerful, or that have shifted your perspective, or inspired you or moved you to take some kind of action in your life or in your community. And as you think about those movies, I also want you to think about, oh, I'm loving all of these cool movie titles that are appearing in the chat. I also want you to think a little bit about why those movies made such a powerful impact on you. And I want you to keep thinking about that as we move through this presentation. You're welcome to discuss that in the chat as we move forward as well. So one of the things that occurred to me is that both movies and project-based language learning are grounded in the idea of immersion. They are both experiences where the participant is dumped into kind of an unfamiliar setting, or in some cases, pieces of the setting may be familiar to them or elements of the environment, but in general, they don't know what's going to happen. And there are a variety of events that do occur, and their job is to kind of make sense of what's going on. So if you are sitting in a movie theater, you are trying to figure out what's going on in the movie. If you are participating in a project-based language learning experience, you're trying to figure out what's going on and how you can accomplish whatever the end goal of the project might be. So it seems to me that we can learn a lot from the movie industry about how to make those experiences more successful for our language learners. Because if you think about it, unlike a person who writes a book, a director only has between 90 minutes and 2 to 2.5 hours to do a ton of things. They have to get the audience to understand the structure of the make-believe world or of the world that they've created for us in the movie. They have to help us understand the culture of that world, and they have to help us understand the rules of how that world works. Additionally, they have to help the audience to want to participate in that world, to suspend their disbelief, so to speak, and help them learn the language of that world. As if that weren't enough to accomplish, they're also trying to get us to know a variety of different people, to understand those people, to understand what has happened in their past, and to understand why they are doing the things that they are doing. And that's very analogous to what we have to do in project-based language learning. We are trying to get students to understand the structure, culture, and rules of a particular project-based language learning context. We want them to connect with the people or characters who are participating in that context. And we want to help them to use their language to develop relationships with those characters, with those people, so that they understand why things are the way that they are, and that they can start to make decisions and take action based on the situations that they're encountering. In order to do all of that, the director has to teach us things that are relevant about the world. So, for example, if the movie happens to be about something related to the environment, then the director has to somehow get us to understand key disciplinary concepts or content related to that environment. They have to clarify the conflict and progressively develop the plot and help us to resolve issues that come up in the course of the movie in ways that leave us feeling intellectually and emotionally satisfied. We want to do the same thing for our students in project-based language learning. We are trying to teach them disciplinary concepts that they need in order to solve real-world problems or in order to participate in real-world activities with authentic audiences. And we want their participation with those audiences to be very intellectually and emotionally satisfying, both for the participants and for our language learners. So how do movies accomplish all of that? Well, the directors are very, very, very skilled at selecting bite-sized chunks out of life's complexity and presenting us with those in carefully scaffolded ways. There is a professor at Michigan State University who has talked quite a bit about this, and the idea that in order to truly learn something, we have to make multiple passes through that information or through those ideas, and we have to have opportunities to do things with those ideas or to engage with those ideas in meaningful ways that enable us to grapple with the complexity. And project-based language learning gives us an opportunity to do just that. So if we think about some of the strategies and techniques that movie makers use in order to accomplish this, we start to get a little more insight into what we might need to do with our language learners. So first of all, you will notice that most movies don't spend a ton of time with somebody standing there on the screen saying, okay, here's how the world's set up, and explaining these are all the things that are going to happen in the movie, and this is how it's going to go, and here's what you should think about it at the end. Instead, they look for ways to show us what it is that they want us to understand, and to engage us with the world. And they do that through the costumes, through the scenery, and through the dialogue. In a similar fashion, as teachers, we need to find ways to accomplish that with our students, and we're going to look at some specific strategies for doing that in a language learning context in just a minute. You'll notice that movie makers guide the audience's attention very, very carefully. So instead of just providing the whole world and expecting us to make sense of it, they use camera angles, they use the color of the costumes, they use particular objects within the scene, and they use very carefully designed scenes that progress from one to the next in order to carefully guide our attention and in order to support our thinking about what we're seeing. And they use a lot of concepts, metaphors, and a variety of other techniques in order to help us think about what it is that we're being presented with in the movie. Probably the most fundamental piece of movie making has to do with the way that movie makers influence our emotions or evoke emotions from us. And they use lighting, they use music, and they use events in the plot in order to accomplish that. And they structure and sequence those very carefully. For those of you who are a little more familiar with project-based language learning, you might be familiar with the idea of entry events, or the idea that we might want to connect students to experts. Those are some of the ways that we can evoke this same kind of emotion. Meaningful movies provoke personal reflection by engaging us with characters and conflict, and they promote social action through the plot and the way that the plot is resolved, or that the conflicts in the plot are resolved. They make us want to change things in our own lives. So if we had to simplify all of that, we might say that the movie industry carefully scaffolds these key items. They scaffold our physical experience, they scaffold the community in which the movie watching takes place, they scaffold the content that we are presented with in the movie, they scaffold our thinking, they scaffold language, and they scaffold technology. And what I mean by scaffolding is just the idea that they provide support so that we can absorb the experience more readily in a short period of time. In a similar fashion, we need to scaffold those same things for our learners. And so one of the issues with project-based language learning is that a lot of times teachers assume that language is the big holdup, especially for beginning language learners. They just don't know enough language to be able to do this activity or participate in this event. And the reality is, typically language is, well, maybe I shouldn't say typically, but certainly language is one of many things that we need to be scaffolding, and it is often a failure to scaffold the other components of the learning environment that produces the breakdown, not a lack of target language ability. So we're going to take a look at each of those items and talk about how we might scaffold each of those elements. And we're going to begin with physical space. So when you think about how we manage a visit to the theater, you will start to find that when everything from the very entrance up, from driving up to the theater all the way through the theatrical experience is carefully scaffolded in terms of the physical space. And we're going to talk about each one of these items individually. So first of all, you'll notice that the physical arrangement of the space guides movement. The physical layout of this particular space forces traffic to move in a certain direction. It makes clear what it is that we're supposed to pay attention to, where we're supposed to get our tickets, how we're supposed to enter and exit, simply because of the design of the space. Likewise, in a project-based language learning situation, we want to be thinking about how we're organizing our classroom, or if students are participating in things out in the community, how we are organizing their movements through that space. Are we using the physical structure of the space to guide the flow of activity that activities that students participate in? You'll notice that distractions are minimized in a movie theater. They dim the lights. In some cases, the only thing that's visible might be a fluorescent clock, and in some cases, even that is not present. And they ask the moviegoers to minimize those distractions as well. The arrangement of the theater facilitates the kinds of behaviors and interactions that we want. Everyone is facing the screen because we want them to pay attention to the screen. And yet, a lot of times in classrooms, we don't necessarily think about rearranging our space in order to facilitate the various types of language use that students might need at different stages of the project. So, for example, if there is some kind of collaborative task where students are supposed to be generating ideas or putting things together, then reconfiguring the way that their desks are set up so that it forces them to all be focused on that particular task is one important piece of scaffolding. This is an arrangement that happens to be helpful when it comes to pair work. Small group work, you might set things up in pods if you're lucky enough to have tables. A horseshoe layout might be useful if you're thinking about some sort of debate or whole class conversation. In a movie theater, they make relevant resources and materials easy to access, but they also sort of position things so that it's not so easy to access that we want to get up and leave the movie in order to go accomplish it. And so things are structured in such a way that they help us to complete appropriate activities at appropriate times. We need to think about how we distribute materials and resources in our classes. Are things color-coded to facilitate, if we're doing pair work so that person A and person B each can easily find the material that they need in order to complete the activity? Have we organized or gathered things into baggies or tubs and put those on each table, or have them ready so that each group can have their own set of supplies? Thinking about those kinds of things can save a ton of class time and can really support language learners in being able to do what they need to do. Those things can also be labeled to facilitate communication. You'll notice that when you go into a movie theater, there is a very clear process provided that helps generate curiosity and interest, and that helps students to comply with the norms and things that are a part of the process. So most theaters now have some sort of little advertisements that are usually silly skits of some sort that encourage people to not be like the person on the video who is disrupting everybody's movie, that encourage people to turn off cell phones, to not talk, and those sorts of things. And then we also have previews that invite people to start to get excited about the experience of watching a movie. Entry events and careful routines and procedures can also facilitate this in a language classroom. And then last of all, when we think about physical space, if you think about your favorite places to go watch movies, for example, there are some theaters now that have recliners that you can reserve for watching your movie. Do people want to spend time in this space? Is the space not only physically comfortable, but also aesthetically interesting? And how are we arranging our classrooms to create the same kind of environment that promotes curiosity and interest in inquiry? And so from a classroom perspective, that might mean completely changing the spaces where we are asking students to spend time. In some cases, it might just mean moving to a different room, and in other cases, it might mean reconfiguring our rooms. Lauren mentioned in her presentation about the importance of scaffolding learning community. And so we're going to talk for just a few minutes about what that might look like. There are a number of things that generate learning community when you think about a movie, not only the aesthetics and organization of the space, but there is a very consistent set of routines and procedures that we follow every time we go to a movie. And although every movie is different, those routines and procedures remain relatively similar. The same is true in a project-based language learning context. We want to make sure that we have clear routines and procedures for the kinds of tasks that are going to be a part of every project, whether that is forming groups, or whether that is brainstorming or prioritizing or assigning roles, having discussions in class, or completing projects or reporting on projects. The more consistent our routines and procedures for doing those things, the easier it is for novice learners in particular to use their language to accomplish those things, because the routine is predictable and they don't have to spend time thinking about that. And the language becomes predictable because we use similar language each time, even though some of the topics that we're discussing might change. There are clear norms for participating in a theater experience. You're not supposed to talk during the movie. You're not supposed to have your cell phone or your computer or your iPad glaring and distracting people from what's on the screen. In a similar fashion, we can set up group norms for small group work so that students can interact successfully with one another and with the content. Instructions are very clear in a movie, and things are modeled. Even things like not texting is modeled for the audience before we begin the movie. In a similar fashion, we need to do similar things if there are particular things we want students to do as part of a project-based language learning experience. And particularly with novice learners, modeling goes a lot further than explaining, and we can always use explanation to clarify later. We want to make sure that students have the social language that they need in order to participate in a project-based language learning experience. If you think about doing group work, for example, or when you are collaborating with colleagues, a lot of that collaboration isn't just about the content, it's using phrases and expressions that help you to talk about how you're feeling about that content or about other people's participation. And so if we want students to stay in the target language, we need to build that into the things that they're doing. And that can be as simple as providing word banks at the bottom of their worksheets with phrases for them to try out or to practice, and also sentence frames and other things that I'll show you some examples of in just a second. And finally, we want to make sure that we are fostering an environment that makes space for questions and for taking risks. We want students to know that it's okay for them to make mistakes with their language. And as they become comfortable with that, and they find that they are in an environment where people don't make fun of them, or they don't get in trouble or penalized, as Lauren mentioned, for not being able to do certain things in the target language, we will find that they are more willing to participate. Probably one of the biggest breakdowns in terms of scaffolding is actually not language, but content. And there are a variety of things that we need to do in order to scaffold content. So when you're faced with unfamiliar content, it's going to be really difficult for you, even as an adult in your native language, to understand, for example, quantum physics or some subjects that you're not particularly familiar with if you have no prior knowledge of it. One of the things that we can do for our students, our language learners, is to activate what we know they already know about the topic as a way of helping them or preparing them to be able to engage with the topic and to absorb new information on whatever it is that we are going to be exploring together. In some cases, we might need to build some knowledge within our students, and that doesn't necessarily mean explaining to them, but it has more to do with giving them activities to participate in, both short-term and long-term kinds of inquiry activities that help them to build conceptual schema about the issues that we're discussing and the cultural context in which those issues or problems are taking place. We can connect students to experts, and we need to be thinking about developing their understanding progressively. As teachers, we have a tendency to want to tell them everything up front, and then we let them play and explore and ask questions. Instead of thinking about how a movie director would do it, they don't tell us everything up front. They give us little bits and pieces at a time, and then they provide just enough information for us to understand whatever's going on in that particular scene. Likewise, in a project-based language learning context, if we as teachers work from the concrete to the abstract, providing just enough scaffolding for students to complete whatever piece of the project is happening at that moment, we will find that students develop understanding and language skill much more rapidly. One way that we can support them in doing this is by using analogies, diagrams, examples, images, and metaphors to explain things to them. And this is because those things help them to make connections between what they're learning and what they already know. And they also make what they are supposed to be learning very concrete and very physical, visible ways. So let's take a look at some of the ways that movies do these things. So for example, when we think about activating prior knowledge, sometimes a simple image can accomplish that. For example, in this case, if you think about Harry Potter, most of us have had some sort of experience, whether in real life or through reading or through other movies, about what goes on in a castle. And so when we see a castle, we automatically, that automatically invokes a certain set of schema that help us to think about what we might do with our, what kinds of language, what kinds of topics we might be discussing. In a similar fashion, we can use graphic organizers or images to activate students' prior knowledge about specific contexts in which our projects might be taking place, and they can be thinking about what they already know. We need to build conceptual schema, and that basically means helping students understand how key pieces of the project-based language learning context are related to one another. And that can happen through mind maps or diagrams like this one. We can connect learners to experts who are familiar with the kinds of things that we want students to actually do in preparing their projects for real-world audiences. So, for example, if I want my students to make a movie or to create a public service announcement advocating for a particular issue or to inform people regarding a particular issue, I might make a connection with a target language speaker who does that particular thing and give students opportunities to learn from that expert in the process of actually completing the activities. Just as the script or the writer of a script develops our understanding progressively, we need to think about that for students as well. So one of the things that a lot of teachers try to do is present all of the vocabulary they think students might possibly need so that they could understand every word before participating in a project-based language learning experience. And realistically, when you think about it, we can accomplish most of the tasks that we might need to using very simple language. And so helping students learn to express complex thoughts using simple language and setting up the activities or tasks so that they are learning the language that they need to complete the task through the task, as opposed to standing there showing them PowerPoints of all of the vocabulary or making them memorize vocabulary lists first. And this is a real shift in the ways that we think about teaching vocabulary in particular. But if you think about how children learn vocabulary, they learn it in context as they're participating in things and people name things or use language that they then pick up themselves as they complete those same activities. Diagrams and images and metaphors we've already talked about, but this might be a really simple example of how we might show students how things are related. One of the other big things that a lot of teachers find frustrating is the idea of scaffolding input. And so there are three key principles as we think about having students read or listen to or view information that will help them to complete the project. The first thing is that instead of altering the culturally authentic texts that they are encountering, we might need to change what we're asking them to do with those texts. Secondly, it's okay for students to make multiple passes through the same text for different purposes. So they might work with the same reading or article or video clip, but each time they watch it, they do something different with it. And that multiple exposure progressively enables them to understand more each time. And as they do different tasks, it helps them to think about the content of that passage differently each time in ways that help them to see new things and understand new things. And then thinking about providing pre, during, and post-reading, viewing, or listening activities. There are a lot of things that we can do to help students with these kinds of tasks. And probably the biggest ones are activating their prior knowledge, are encouraging them to communicate complex ideas in simple language, encouraging them to make personal connections to what they're learning, and giving them opportunities to create with language. So if I were to think about this in terms of input, processing, and output, how are they going to acquire the ideas and information they need in order to complete the project? How are they going to think about, or how are we going to scaffold their thinking and processing of those ideas? And then how are we going to prepare them to share their ideas, information, and opinions that they've learned during the project with a public audience? I will post some links in connection with this presentation for places where you can go to get ideas for pre-reading, during reading, and post-reading activities. This might be one example that would work very well in terms of developing proficiency for beginning language learners. So maybe they've read or watched a text, a paragraph of some sort, and we're asking them to pick a sentence, a phrase, and a word out of that passage or text that resonates with them. This helps them to focus on specific pieces of language that they can then appropriate for their own use and helps them to make personal connections with the text. We want students to focus on big ideas. And so instead of thinking about everything in terms of grammar and vocabulary, if we will think about how can I help students to engage with this conceptual content? How can I help students to develop the skills they need to do this particular task? We will suddenly discover that the language piece comes very naturally. Multiple representations can also be a key piece of helping students to understand both language and content. And so positioning them so that they can see words used in different contexts, or so that they can see different images of a particular vocabulary word that we might be working with or concept that we're working with, can help them to acquire the information more quickly. Helping students to see structure and content using graphic organizers. Grouping things can be very helpful to students and can help them to organize their own thinking in preparation for language production. Cognition, or how students think about or process the things that they're encountering, is another important thing to scaffold. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move pretty quickly through this. But these are some of the types of thinking processes we might need to scaffold. We might need to guide students' attention. We might need to put processes or protocols in place so that they can analyze things. We might need to structure processes for creativity and decision-making. We might need to carefully organize the processes they're going to use to complete the project. We might need to structure opportunities for reflection or searching for information or synthesizing information. So here's an example of how I might scaffold students' attention simply by using color coding. I want students to recognize that in order to form positive to commands, all they have to do in Spanish is remove the GO at the end of the first person singular form of the verb, and that's where the command comes from. In order to help them see this pattern, I've color-coded the commands in blue and the part that they're supposed to remove in red. Leading them by guiding their eyes, and since this slide is in the presentation, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but using principles of graphic design to actually structure students' cognition can be very helpful. Scaffolding analysis, so providing worksheets and templates that give students a chance to really carefully think through things one step at a time. So what main idea is it that we want to talk about, that you read in the reading or that you encountered in the course of during the course of the project? Do you agree or disagree with the idea? And so they're supposed to fill in the bubbles based on whether they agree or disagree. What strengths or opportunities does that idea provide, and what concerns or weaknesses does that idea have? And this allows students to analyze whatever it is that they're thinking about. But a lot of times we have to structure that thinking. If we want them to do things that are creative, we need to establish procedures for how are they going to brainstorm or generate ideas. How are we going to capture those ideas? How are we going to prioritize and select which ideas we're going to use? So a lot of times when teachers are concerned that students don't have the language to accomplish a task, it's not that they don't have the language for the task, it's that the processes haven't been structured well enough that the language is readily apparent there. If we have carefully scaffolded each of these processes, then students will generally be successful at completing them, even if they are novice learners, because we have provided both the structure and usually key words that they need to accomplish them. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to skip through these last things just so that you can kind of see some other ideas for what this might look like. So I could have students use Post-it notes to respond to ideas. That might be one way of capturing brainstorming. I could give students a worksheet that helps them to think through if, for example, if I'm asking them to create a game of some sort for some kind of community purpose, then they're going to need to think about what kinds of games they like to play. What are their favorites? What makes them fun to play? How were those games structured? What pieces did the game include? And those kinds of decisions are decisions they will have to make in order to actually generate the game. And so kind of thinking step by step through the process that we want students to participate in order to complete the project is really, really important. We need to scaffold their analysis and their reflection, and we can do that very easily with graphic organizers, getting them to compare and contrast, and we can use technological tools to scaffold their search. There are a variety of different protocols, pedagogical strategies we can use to scaffold things like synthesis, and I'll post a link to some of those, as well as sentence stems or questions that we can use to get students thinking. And finally, the language piece. There are so many aspects of language that could be scaffolded that it could take an entire 2 weeks to explain them all. So we're not going to spend time on everything, but I just want to give you a taste of things to kind of think about. And this slide will be in the presentation so you can look at it more carefully later. But when we're thinking about asking novice learners to participate in project-based language learning, we need to be thinking about the kinds of tasks we're giving them. If I'm working with novice learners, they can still brainstorm, they can still discuss, they can still do a lot of those kinds of things, but I'm going to have to structure my tasks and processes so that what they are producing is only isolated words and phrases, and that I'm strategically moving them toward producing or connecting those words and phrases into sentences and strings of sentences. They can label, they can list, they can name, and they're going to need a lot of formulaic kinds of scaffolding in order to be able to accomplish those processes. When I get to more advanced learners, they can take more control of their own learning and of their own process and of their own language. And so this little chart is designed to sort of help students or help teachers see what that progression might look like so that you know what you might want to start thinking about scaffolding. Here are some different types of scaffolding. They can all be used at all of the levels, but things like sentence stems and word walls are going to be especially helpful to novices. Transitional words and phrases are going to be more appropriate for students at the intermediate levels of proficiency who are learning to make connections between ideas. And then thinking about things like academic vocabulary and idiomatic expressions, things that they might need at the advanced level in order to perform advanced level functions. We also want to think in terms of language functions. So what kinds of things are we asking students to do with language? And it's important to remember that those language functions can occur in a variety of different ways. So for example, if I'm working with beginning level learners, they can say you should do something or you should not do something, debes and no debes, using a regular ER verb. Whereas for more advanced learners, I might ask them to use the present subjunctive to accomplish those things. So focusing on the function rather than just on the grammar required to accomplish a task, and then choosing grammar and vocabulary that's appropriate for the proficiency level of your learner. And then progressively expanding the context in which I'm having students work. If I'm working with novice learners, then we're probably going to be using smaller contexts, more familiar contexts, than if I'm working with advanced learners. I'm going to quickly flip through a lot of different examples of types of scaffolding. So you can scaffold with questions and paragraph frames, and by providing different structures for the text. You can scaffold by providing transitional words for different types of language functions. You can scaffold by providing different types of phrases and conversation helpers, formulas. There are a couple of other examples there. You can use technological tools to scaffold. So TriCiter is a tool that allows you to pose this question, and then students can brainstorm ideas, can give pros and cons, can vote for those pros and cons, and can vote for the ideas, and can add different arguments. And so this is a great way to scaffold in a written form an eventual conversation that I might want students to have about those issues. You can scaffold by having students compare and contrast using Venn diagrams. Students can make assertions, or you can give students assertions and ask them to find evidence in a text or from a text that they cut and paste. You can have them do it in terms of pros and cons, how the U.S. does it versus how the target country does it, whether the evidence is credible or not credible, and they can find examples of those things. That scaffolds both input, processing, and prepares them for output. You can do things like a picture walk, where students take turns adding nouns, verbs, and adjectives so that they know in small groups to each of the pictures, so that when they're done, they have a nice word bank of words that they can then use to construct sentences together. You can give them choice webs. So, for example, maybe we're going to go on an adventure, and now they have to choose. Are we going to go to Spain or Venezuela? And is the adventure going to take place in a forest, on an island, or in the mountains? And are we going to discover a dangerous animal, an interesting idea, a famous person, or a magic object? You could set up a similar structure for a project so that students are making choices along the way, and so that when they finish, they are able to actually write about the process that they took to accomplish the project because you've already provided the storyline or the web for them. You can provide them structures for beginning, middle, and end of stories. You can set up worksheets so that they can start to generate the phrases that they need in order to say whatever it is that they want to say about, their particular project or person. You can organize the worksheets so that it's very clear where they're supposed to write their answers and what they're supposed to say. So in this case, what does he like to eat is the question. The answer is he likes to eat blank. And then the novice learner has to go around and have that conversation with their partners. And for each of the numbers, they have to write the answer of a different partner so that when they're finished, they can actually have a discussion or a conversation about this. This is an example of how you might structure an oral presentation. So students are gathering information about other people in terms of what they can do to improve the world, what their talents are. Having guidelines for class discussion, and using rejoinders, because rejoinders are part of the social language we use when we work in groups. And so instead of saying good job, giving students other kinds of language that they might use to express disagreement or agreement or surprise or disbelief, so that they start to acquire that language in the course of the project. Finally, scaffolding technology. We don't really have time to go into that today, but there are lots and lots of tools that you can use that will scaffold students' production of creative projects. Things like magazines, newspapers, stories, annotating text, or producing screencasts, or writing collaboratively. So if we were to summarize, we want to make sure that the support that we're providing to students happens when and where they need it, instead of trying to provide everything up front. We want to structure activities so that our students learn the language in context. We want sustained inquiry to provide the backstory, so allowing students to explore the project-based language learning context instead of feeling compelled to give them everything up front, and allowing things to progress slowly and allowing them to grapple with things. It's okay for them not to understand everything. And as we do those things, the other thing that I would suggest is that you're going to make a lot of mistakes, and there are going to be a lot of failures, and you're going to find that some things work and some things only partially work and some things don't work at all for your language learners or in a given context. And so progressively revising the scaffolding that we put together and adapting techniques that really work from one project to another can progressively improve our ability as teachers to facilitate project-based language learning. And so with that, I think we're ready for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
All right. Hi, Cherise. Stephen here. I've been watching the questions come up in the chat, and I'd like to note that some of the questions concern project-based language learning fairly directly, and other ones are more about general pedagogical principles that come into play when we're trying to apply project-based language learning. For example, classroom management, those kind of skills. So I'm going to take things in a certain order, not the same order that the questions were asked in, but sort of in a priority level, the things that are really specific to project-based language learning first, and then we'll branch out into more general concerns, pedagogical concerns after. So first of all, I want to remark that in Lauren's presentation, Lauren said something very important. She said, here's a typical sequence of activities that we would do in a more traditional classroom, and it ends with some kind of presentation or project. And now here is a structure that's based on project-based language learning where there is, the project is presented to the students at the beginning. You say, we're going to do this. We're going to have this final product. And in order to get to that final product, we need to go through a number of cyclical stages. And as we do that, as we approach it, we're going to have benchmarks. So those benchmarks are opportunities to pause and reflect and check how everyone is doing. But those things that we do to get to each benchmark are really the same kinds of activities that we do typically as language teachers all the time. It's just that you're packaging them differently. You're packaging them with a much larger purpose. So learning about PBLL is really, of course, we're learning about pedagogy, but we know more than we might think we know already. It's a question of sort of reordering and reframing the things that we do already. So with that said, the first question that I would like you to address, Cherise, and also I would like to invite Lauren or Liliana to jump in by clicking their microphone button if they're still around and if they want to answer. What is an entry event? I think our varying levels of experience among our attendees mean that some people don't know what an entry event is. Can you talk about that?
So this is Lauren. An entry event is a way to get students interest piqued and to get them excited about the launch of the project. And so when you're thinking about beginning a project, you don't want to take the project packet and drop it on every student's desk and say, okay, let's look through this, here's what we're going to be doing. But you want to begin with an entry event that sparks the inquiry in students, that really gets them thinking about what is this all about? What questions do I now have based on experiencing this entry event? So it can be just a quick film clip that gets them interested in what you're about to talk about. The entry event that I mentioned earlier in the technology presentation was bringing in a speaker. So they had somebody come in and actually speak about how they felt disconnected from the school community based on the fact that they were not primary speaking English at home. So you can have a guest speaker, you can show a movie clip, you can bring the students somewhere. You can also just have a provocative conversation to begin a project. But it's really in the spirit of launching the inquiry. And Liliana, is there anything you might want to add there?
Liliana, you'll have to click your mic button if you're going to jump in and add something.
Hi. I just added in the chat. Use statistics if there's a problem that they need to solve. Have a facilitated discussion. You can write a simulated letter or a real letter from the authentic audience of who we're trying to target. But it's always going to be, how are we going to hook these students to be excited to want to learn the content, the language, and make it all real for them?
All right, thanks, Liliana. Okay, so I think that our participants now have the message that an entry event is an event that sparks students' curiosity and directs them towards that eventual product that they're going to make that would have real-world relevance. All right, back to Charisse. A lot of the questions that came in had to do with the use of the target language versus the use of the students' local environment language, let's say English. And that question, of course, goes beyond project-based language learning itself. It's a general pedagogical question that we as foreign language or world language educators need to address all the time. But I think that people are afraid that project-based language learning somehow demands this cognitive sophistication that the students aren't prepared to deal with in the target language. I think I can predict that what you say is going to go back to that quote about movies, that they are bite-sized chunks of life's complexity. Can you expand on that just for a minute or two?
Definitely. I think, as Lauren mentioned in the first presentation, a lot of it is really about the classroom community that we craft or develop, and the ways in which students are accustomed to working. So if you are a teacher who insists that, or who chooses to remain in the target language during class, and if you conduct class in the target language and encourage students to use as much of the target language as possible, you are going to find that students don't have much difficulty transitioning to the use of the target language in a project-based language learning context. In fact, I would propose that it's actually easier in a lot of ways to stay in the target language and to encourage or motivate students to use the target language in a project-based language learning context, because there are real things that they are working with and on that motivate them to want to talk and to communicate, and that they are working with real world, building relationships with people in the real world who speak the target language so that they want to be able to get their language correct and to use the language to accomplish those things. So a lot of it is about teacher expectations. And as I mentioned during the presentation, a lot of it is scaffolding the cognition and the content so that they can be successful with the language. A lot of times it's not that they can't express what they want to say in the target language, it's that we haven't done a good enough job of scaffolding their thinking or of preparing them to engage with the content so that they can simplify their thinking and express those complex thoughts in simple language. And one way that you can kind of approach that is to encourage them to think about, okay, if you were going to explain this to your 5-year-old little brother, what would you say in English or in whatever the native language is? Okay, now we're going to use those same words in the target language because a lot of times they're so accustomed to thinking in very complex and sophisticated ways that they don't recognize that you can say those same things in a much more simplistic form.
All right, thanks, Charisse. There are so many other worthwhile questions, and we've come to the end of our scheduled time. Please, everyone, be aware that over the next few days, your questions may well be answered in subsequent presentations or question and answer sessions. But I think we have time to address one more thing, and that seems to be a theme. Some people are dealing with classes that have a lot more students, say 25 or 30 students in the classroom, and are addressing the issue of feedback, student production, and how you give feedback to students. I'm going to grab this question myself. I think that is too many students for a language classroom. The ideal size should be 20 or less. I mean, that's something that we all know, but that's not reality a lot of the time. And I would like to suggest that project-based learning can actually be an aid to you in this instance, because project-based learning of necessity means students are self-motivated to get to that final product, and so they are going to support each other in producing the language that they need. Also, in a project-based learning model, it's not expected that students work one time on producing something and get it right the first time. Revision is an essential element in project-based learning overall, and in project-based language learning too. And so it's expected that students will work together to improve their output as they go along. And it's less of a teacher-centered model than some of the traditional classrooms that we see.
I would just add to that language learning is, I was talking with a colleague this week about language learning and the difference between achievement and performance. And I think in a lot of ways as a profession, we're still very focused on kind of an achievement model of language learning, that somehow when students get to the end of a unit or a chapter, they have achieved or completed or covered the content and therefore are ready to move on. But if you think about your own language in your native, your own ability to speak your native language, you are continuously learning new words, new phrases, new ways of saying things. And so language learning is very much an ongoing process that is never completed. And if you can kind of reframe your thinking about language teaching then, using that same kind of an idea, it can really position you to have some major shifts in focusing less on what you're teaching and more on what students are learning to do with language in the process of completing their various projects and things.
That's so right. Thanks, Charisse. And everyone, we look forward to seeing you in our webinar tomorrow at the same time, same channel. Look for email from Jim, and thank you so much, almost 150 of you, for participating today. It's been a great experience, and the chat has been very active. All right, until tomorrow, ahuiho and aloha.